Hello everyone, this video is designed to help any A-level student of politics, both sitting an Edexcel or AQA paper, when it comes to the case studies for paper 1, electoral systems. Here is an excerpt from the Pearson Edexcel specification, and this is what you need to know for the case studies. There will be three, one 1945 to 92, 1997 and one post-1997. We need to look at the impact on parties and government, the reasons for and the impact of party policies and manifestos, election campaigns, the wider political context set that the election is set in, class-based voting, other factors such as partisanship and voter attachment, gender, age, ethnicity and region as factors influencing voting behaviour, turnout and trends. And for those students studying the AQA level, there is more detail for you to need to take into the exam. It is more generic when it comes to the pre-97 election. It just says any before, but you can see the detail in the specification when it comes to what you need to know is more detailed than the Edexcel paper. Although they do follow similar themes: voting behaviour over time, the impact of the media, policies and the effect on the outcome of the election, manifestos and the effect of manifestos on the outcome, campaigns and leadership, which is similar but adds that focus on party leaders compared with Edexcel, influence on policy and policy making, effects of the electoral system on the party system, and ideally your examples will have one election that results in a landslide, at least one election that has a clear discrepancy between votes and seats gained, so-called electoral deserts, areas where voters are disenfranchised because of the popularity or lack of one party in a particular region of the UK, and one election where a leadership style or personality has impacted the result. So, what I'm going to try to do is provide information that satisfies everybody. Now, you might find that you want more detail in certain areas, and what I would recommend is just leave a comment in the video to tell me what you would like. If you've used a different case study to the ones that I've used, just pop it in there and I'll do my best to provide an example for you. So, for the pre-97 case studies, the two most popular, certainly the ones that are covered at my school, are 1979 or 1983. What I would say about the 1997 election, and I say this to my students, is that is the one case study that the examiners are expecting to see in any question about elections. The examiner will not know if you've covered 2017 in class, whatever it might be. So if you have a good example from another election, use it. Don't feel like you mustn't use it because it wasn't one of your three case studies. If you have knowledge that's applicable to the essay, get it in there. So the two case studies prior to 97 that I'm going to look at are 79 and 83, Thatcher's first and second victories. I will then cover 1997 as the key focus for each factor that we look at. And then post-1997, there's a lot more variation in what people study. Some people and some schools look at 2010 and the coalition government. 2017, we get a minority government, which is very rare in British politics. 2019 gives us a decisive victory for Boris Johnson, and for students of AQA, particularly when we're looking at the impact of leadership, we can look at both Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn as good examples of the impact of leadership on an election result there. And you may, but you won't be expected to, have knowledge of 2024 that you could provide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the AQA list because that is the most detailed of the two. Go through it one at a time with a focus on 1997 first of all, and then an example both before and after that election case study. So let's start with voting behaviour in the 1997 general election. And this information has come from Ipsos Mori. You see the link there, How Britain Voted in 1997. What you actually see when you click on that link and you look at that information is Labour was popular or more popular with almost every demographic you look at, with the exception of voters in the South East, South West and East Anglia. Labour led in all regions of the UK. Labour's lead was lower in Scotland than other regions of England because of the impact that the SNP had on the vote in Scotland. But Labour had a 14% lead with men, 12% lead with women. They led with all age groups, but the age group they led with most was the 18 to 34-year-olds. They led with both white and non-white voters, but you can see there that the majority over the Conservatives amongst white voters was 11%, compared with 52% of all non-white voters. The two regions of the UK where Labour led more handsomely than others, they led with Northerners, a 39% majority over the Conservatives in the north, and an 18% majority in the City of London. Interestingly, and we'll cover the media later on, Labour led by 22 percentage points with readers of the Sun newspaper. We'll look at the impact of the media in a later slide. But what I want to focus on more than those is class-based voting behaviour. In the 1970s, Pulitzer said, "Class is the basis of British party politics. All else is embellishment and detail." And what we expect to see, the traditional relationship between class and voting behaviour, is that A, B and C1 classes more likely to vote Conservative, and C2, D, E most likely to vote Labour. And we can see that that relationship certainly exists in 1997. And I want you to focus particularly on the Conservative lead over Labour. The only social class that the Conservatives led was the AB social class. And you can see that Labour's lead increases as we move down the social classes to DE, the working class. You can see it's split. There's no lead for either party with C1. But that relationship between social class and voting seems to still be in place. And actually looking at Labour's lead with non-white voters, Northerners, Londoners, that partisanship, there's still evidence of it existing. And class-based voting still very much seems to be important. There is a direct link between one's social class and how likely they are to vote Labour. And that rule being, the further you move down the social classes, Labour's vote share increases. Okay. The comparison I'm going to provide here is 1979. This information is also from Ipsos Mori, and Thatcher's Conservatives led with men and women. You can see that Thatcher's lead with women is much higher, 12%. In fact, during the campaign in 1979, Jim Callaghan almost embarrassingly admitted that his wife may vote Conservative because there was a woman in charge of the Conservative Party, and that got a lot of media attention. Thatcher's Conservatives led with all age group, and there's no clear correlation between age and voting intention. I would argue that in a modern context, there very much is a correlation. The older you get, the more likely you are to vote Conservative over time. You can see that the Conservatives led by 35% of ABC1, so-called middle-class voters. So again, very much the case that class-based political identity is still very much true in the 1970s. You can also see the Conservatives trailed by 15% with working class voters and the Labour Party. But what is interesting there is that the Conservatives' performance improved with that working class group of voters by 20% from 1974. And for the very first time, we start to talk about these so-called working class Conservatives moving over to the Conservative Party in the long term. There has always been a minority of working class voters that were allied with the Conservatives, going back to, certainly you could go back as far as 1945. But there is a strong minority of voters in 1979, working class voters voting for the Conservative Party. I think that's not enough to say that class-based voting doesn't exist in 1979. I think it does, but it is important to note that there is a minority, a sizable minority of working class voters going over to the Conservatives, some of whom are voting Conservative for the very first time. And the post-1997 example I've got for voting behaviour is 2019. On the left, you can see this is YouGov data, vote by social grade. And actually, I don't think there is much to suggest that there is any class-based voting behaviour. I actually think that those old school definitions of social class aren't applicable in contemporary British society. You can actually see that the Conservative vote share increases as we go down the social classes, which goes against that rule that we spoke about previously. I think that the clear correlation now when it comes to long-term voting behaviour factors is age. You can see there that the Liberal Democrat vote share in 2019 stays pretty stable. But what does change quite massively is the votes for the Labour and Conservative parties as voters get older. Now, with an ageing population, age-based voting behaviour is something that should be music to the ears of the Conservative Party, because you can see there that the most loyal voter group are those aged over 70 years old. Just 14% for the Labour Party, 67% for the Conservatives. Labour's strongest lead was with voters aged 18 to 24, 56 to 21% over the Conservatives. But as we know, when it comes to turnout, younger voters are least likely to turn out at the ballot box on election day. One thing to mention about 2019 before we move on is this was referred to as the Brexit election. And you can see there how Leave and Remain voters voted in 2019. Now, Labour wasn't a Remain party, but the Conservatives were definitely campaigning on a strong Brexit platform. The campaign was Get Brexit Done. And you can see that the Conservatives managed to retain the vote of 74% of Leave voters. And that is what carried Boris Johnson to victory. So in the Brexit election, you could actually talk about issue-based voting behaviour and how the Conservatives were able to retain far more of the Leave vote than Labour were able to the Remain vote. Only 49% of Remainers voted Labour, and then there were votes for Conservatives, Liberal Democrats, SNP, Greens. There's lots of a diaspora of votes there. So whereas Leave voters were unsure where to turn to in 2019, we can see that the Leave voters were very much clear that they were going to stick with the Conservatives and Boris Johnson's campaign to get Brexit done. Next, we're going to look at the role of the media. And in 1997, what is hugely significant is the support of the Sun newspaper. Now, the Sun newspaper claims to have backed the winning party in every election going back to 1974. And in 1995, Tony Blair takes a trip to Australia to meet with Rupert Murdoch, who was at that point editor of the Sun newspaper, to convince Rupert Murdoch that the Labour Party were worthy of his support. And you can see there that that is exactly what the Sun does. In 1997, the Sun backs Blair, give change a chance. And then on election day, it must be you. Now, I don't expect anyone listening to this video to know what that reference is to, but that hand used to be the National Lottery advert. An invisible hand would appear above somebody and tell them that it might be them that wins the lottery this week. So culturally significant at the time, but a cultural reference that I don't expect anyone watching this video to appreciate. And then once the election was finished, the Sun led with its now very famous headline, "It's the Sun what won it." And the Sun claimed that it was its support for the Labour Party that persuaded voters to trust Tony Blair's Labour Party with their vote. And as you've heard earlier in the video, Sun readers were 22 points, there was a 22-point lead for the Labour Party with Sun readers. Another thing to talk about, and we'll talk about this when we look at campaigns and leadership styles later on, is John Major's portrayal in the media. Spitting Image, which was a televised puppet show in Britain at the time, referred to John Major as the grey man. This idea of that John Major represented an old, boring, bygone time of politics compared with the youth and energy of Tony Blair. And that's how Major was reflected in the British media. It's time now to look at 1983 and the role of the media, a decisive victory for the Conservative Party, and Margaret Thatcher's portrayal as someone who led the country through a successful war in the Falkland Islands the year previous was something that resonated with voters. This perception of Thatcher as the Iron Lady was certainly bolstered and cemented by Britain's brief and successful campaign in the Falkland Islands. We will also look later on at Michael Foot, the Labour leader, and how he was presented in the press. And he was quite often referred to as someone who was unpatriotic. And we'll look at that later on when we look at the impact of campaigns and leadership. I thought it might be good to provide a 2024 example now when it comes to the role of the media. The Sun newspaper, very late in the campaign, came out in support of a Labour victory. And you can see there, as Britain goes to the polls, it's time for a new manager. And then when the result came out, a full front page spread picture of Keir Starmer, winner by Smiles. What's interesting there is it says reform on the rise. And I think the Sun newspaper knows that its readership is mostly of a right-wing persuasion. And many voters, regardless of their politics, left or right, believed that it was time for change. Some of whom will have voted Labour for the first time ever, or the first time in a long time, but others would have flocked to reform. So you can see there that the Sun newspaper is keeping both sides of its readership happy there with a reference to the rise of reform. You can see on the left of the screen how other newspapers covered the result. Interesting that the Daily Express had a picture of Rishi Sunak rather than Keir Starmer, crushing blow to the Tory party in election wipeout. Daily Express being one of the more right-wing newspapers in the country, focusing on the scale of the Tory defeat rather than looking into Starmer's victory. Whereas you can see on the other hand, the left-wing tabloid newspaper, the Daily Mirror, focuses very much on Sir Keir Starmer with Kia We Go. Okay, now it's time to look at the impact of party policies on the election result. And I've tried to summarise the key policies that dominated the Labour campaign. Tony Blair was asked what his three priorities would be in government, and he said education, education, education. And famously, the Labour Party capped class sizes in Key Stage 1 for 30 children and also brought in an assisted places scheme so as to relieve overcrowding in certain primary schools. And another element of Labour's third way socialist approach was they said they would be tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. So being tough on crime meant that youth offender court cases and sentencing would be fast-tracked. But at the same time, the government pledged to put 250,000 youth unemployed into work. And then the Labour Party, a valence issue that the Labour and Conservatives quite often will both promise at election time. Labour promised to cut NHS waiting lists in its first term in government. Back to 1979 and the impact of Thatcher's policy proposals on the election. When she was welcomed into Downing Street, she quoted St Francis of Assisi and said, "Where there is discord, may we bring harmony." Some people would view that as an ironic comment because Thatcher, to some, was the embodiment of divisive politics in the 1980s. And she was certainly promising an end to the consensus of the past. She believed that the consensus politics of the 1970s was a sellout to socialism and was partly responsible for Britain's decline in the previous decade. And part of trying to turn that around in Thatcher's mind was to reduce the power of the trade unions. And that is one thing that she pledged. The 1974 election, which the Conservatives lost to the Labour Party, was called by Ted Heath, and Ted Heath wanted the election to be about who governs Britain. And the Conservatives' defeat showed possibly, in that case, that there was more support for the trade union movement than the government had anticipated. Or maybe the voters had lost faith that the Conservatives were the best party, the best government to deal with union disputes. But one thing that changes the political context of the 1979 election is the winter of discontent of 1978-9, where workers, public sector workers all over the country in a range of areas of work went on strike in that winter over pay and conditions. And that led to reports of rubbish piling up in the streets of London and Birmingham, of bodies unable to be buried in cities around the UK as well because of an undertaker's strike. And that seriously damaged the reputation of Jim Callaghan as the Labour Prime Minister, and may have impacted voters to turn towards Thatcher's promise that she would be tough on the trade union movement. I've used the 2017 election as my post-1997 example here because I think that two-party policies damaged Theresa May at the start of the campaign. And 2017 was a fascinating election campaign because Theresa May was in a very strong position going into it. Labour was seen to be divided under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. He'd already faced a leadership challenge, which he'd survived. And so Theresa May decides that a 12-seat majority in Parliament is not enough and decides to hold a snap general election. And she loses that wafer-thin 12-seat majority in 2017. And two things that impact her when it comes to policy and her reputation was, first of all, the promise in the Conservative Manifesto to remove the triple lock on state pensions. In a press appearance, Theresa May continued to insist that nothing had changed, but the manifesto seemed to suggest that the next Conservative government would remove the triple lock on pensions. The triple lock on pensions, meaning that it would be a minimum of 2.5% rise the state pension year on year, or in line with inflation or wage increases. And so it was seen as an untraditional Conservative Party policy. They often are seen as the party that where government spending is necessary is on our elder citizens. And speaking of older citizens who felt punished by the Conservative Manifesto, we have the so-called dementia tax. Now, this meant that the cap on the cost of social care would rise to £100,000. So £100,000 of your earnings, of your estate, would be protected, no matter how much social care you had needed. Now, that limit was £23,000, so it was going to quadruple. But the reason why it was going to hurt, particularly those who require daily support from social care, is that a person's assets would be included. Now, for most people in this country, if they are a homeowner, their home will be worth far north of £100,000. And so what would happen, had this law been introduced, is the profits of someone's house sale would be immediately lost to paying for social care bills. And so the proposal to scrap the triple lock and including somebody's assets when capping social care costs were both seen to harm what the Conservatives can often consider their most loyal voter base, which is older voters, retired voters. Okay, let's look at the manifestos. When we look at leadership style, we'll talk about a leader-centred campaign. But you can see there with the New Labour manifesto, the manifesto full-page spread, Tony Blair's face, New Labour, Britain deserves better. So it's all about him and it's all about change and bringing this fresh, youthful approach to politics in the 1990s. John Major tried to follow suit and his face was plastered on the front of the 97 election manifesto. You can only be sure with the Conservatives. We're used now in a modern context to maybe snappier campaign slogans. The Conservatives famously in recent years have kept their campaign slogans down to 3 words, famously in 2019 with Get Brexit Done. But the message of the Conservative Manifesto, that you can only be sure with the Conservatives, when the national mood and the context was a desire for political change, and the Conservative Manifesto was calling for things to largely remain the same, it didn't resonate with voters. It didn't have the inspiring change that the opposition was offering. And the manifestos in 1979, the Conservative manifesto promised, as I said previously, those bold changes, an end to consensus politics, a change in economic policy to focus more on controlling inflation rather than unemployment. Whereas the Labour Party's manifesto in 1979, the Labour way is the better way. And again, it's always more difficult for the party that's been in government, particularly through a turbulent time, to offer a set of policies that's going to resonate with voters, particularly when the national mood is desirous of change. And that's what we see in 1979. The loss of confidence vote that Jim Callaghan suffered in Parliament meant that the election was very much one about what do you want, change or more of the same. And Labour suffered in 1979 as a result. I'm going to go back to 2017 for the influence of manifestos. We'll talk first about the Conservative manifesto. It was largely criticised for being uncosted, meaning that spending pledges, it was not clear where that money was going to come from. And one thing to note with the Labour Party manifesto is that details of the manifesto were leaked to the press a week before its full release. And some speculated that those leaks were done so deliberately by the Labour Party so that different Labour policies dominated the news agenda in the build-up to the release of the manifesto. And Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party relied upon a message that even Tony Blair, phraseology that Tony Blair's manifestos referred to. But Jeremy Corbyn's soundbite of the campaign in 2017 was for the many, not the few. A left-wing populism that he had hoped would resonate with voters across the UK. So let's talk about campaigns and leadership now. In 1997, Blair was seen as a young, cool, fresh approach to politics. He was referred to as a Britpop politician. He famously met the Gallagher brothers of Oasis. I can't remember if that was during or after the campaign, but he was seen as representative as of this new era of British culture as well as British politics. He had the so-called spin doctor, his special advisor, Alistair Campbell, leading the campaign. And the campaign was very much dominated by Blair as a person and as a personality. He was, as what you will often see in the textbooks, referred to as media savvy. He'd had significant levels of media training, which meant that he was able to deal with those tough, interrogatory interview styles. And in his early career, it reflected well on him. I suppose the focus as well with the Labour Party was on New Labour and that symbolic Clause 4 of the Constitution, that symbolic commitment to a nationalised economy was removed, and it was seen as a new era under Tony Blair. The official campaign song was D. Ream's Things Can Only Get Better. You may have heard that song when Rishi Sunak called for the election in 2024. At the gates of Downing Street, somebody played it on a loudspeaker. And then John Prescott also took to the battle bus and went up and down the country trying to convince voters to vote for Labour. And Prescott was a politician that Labour could rely on for traditional Labour voters. He was from Hull, he was a working class lad himself, and he very much played up to the working class image, that traditional Labour image, in a way that Tony Blair could not. Compare that with the Conservative Party. We said before how John Major was referred to by spitting image as the grey man. He had referred to certain cabinet members in inglorious terms. And the party, as 'twas ever thus, was seen as divided over the issue of Europe. The Conservative Party were promising a back-to-basics approach. The issue was there were allegations and investigations of sleaze and the Cash for Questions affair, in which Conservative MPs were implicated And the Conservative Party were seen at this time as the party of sleaze, and that John Major hadn't managed to get a grip of the behaviour of certain individuals within the Conservative Party. I want to talk about 1983 when we look at campaigns and leadership. On the far left, you can see Labour's response to what the Conservatives had criticised Labour for in 1979. In 1979, the Conservative Party campaign was Labour isn't working. So 4 years later, the Labour Party gave the unemployment figures on one of its campaign posters, which was as high as 3 million in 1983, and says, see what happens when you don't vote Labour. The Conservatives, on the other hand, were keen to give voters the impression that this was the most left-wing manifesto the nation had seen. And you can see there how the Conservative Party campaign linked the Labour Party's manifesto pledges to references in the Communist Manifesto. And Michael Foot, who was a representative of the left wing of the Labour Party, had been roundly criticised at an event in 1981, I believe, Remembrance Sunday. He was roundly criticised for wearing a donkey jacket, and he was seen as not suitably dressed for the occasion, and built into critics, or the opinion of critics, that Michael Foot was unpatriotic. Okay, campaigns and leadership. It's probably worth talking about Boris Johnson in some detail here. The Conservative campaign was very much focused on a simple message, which was 3 words: get Brexit done. But the Conservative campaign was able to buy into meme culture. You can see there an image of Boris Johnson's mock-up of the Love Actually scene. He also appeared at the JCB headquarters and smashed the metaphorical Brexit wall with a JCB digger in the colours of a Union Jack. And it was a very simple campaign message, but Boris Johnson was trying to appeal to the everyday citizen. And that could, Boris Johnson's leadership approach in 2019 certainly is part of the reason why the so-called Red Wall voted Conservative for the first time. Partly it was due to views on Brexit in those parts of the world, but also opinions of Boris Johnson were high in 2019. It's also worth noticing how unpopular Jeremy Corbyn was. You can see there data from the BBC shows that his net approval rating was minus 38%. Only 20% of voters approved of the job that Jeremy Corbyn was doing as leader of the Labour Party. And one thing that had changed significantly from 2017 to 2019 is his handling of allegations of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. And indeed, after the election and after he is removed as leader of the Labour Party, he was eventually suspended for his handling of allegations of anti-Semitism. What you can see there actually is that not one political leader had a positive public image. Boris Johnson led the way, but 40% of voters disapproved of him as the incumbent Prime Minister. So, although he was the most popular, he was actually still coming to the polls with a net negative approval rating. So let's have a look now at the impact of elections on policy making. The Labour Party, famously with a 179-seat majority after 1997, it meant that the Labour Party was able to implement those ambitious constitutional reforms that had been promised in the manifesto. We get the Human Rights Act in 1998, devolution, referendums, and the peace process concluding in Northern Ireland. So Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have some form of devolution. After 1998, we get the House of Lords Reform Act in 1999, removing all but 92 hereditary peers. We get the introduction of a national minimum wage in 1998. And then we said that one of Labour's focuses was going to be on educational reform. So we get the introduction of the Educational Maintenance Allowance, the EMA, which was designed for sixth form students to receive funding for their studies. The Aim Higher programme, designed at gifted and talented students whose families didn't have a history of going to university. The Sure Start programme, which provided support for young families, a reduction in those primary school class sizes we mentioned before. There was also, after Ofsted reports, if schools were judged to be, in inverted commas, failing, they could be placed into special measures, which was designed to be a supportive process for those schools. And the Labour Party education reform also focused on improving the nation's literacy, numeracy and ICT skills. But what's important here to see is the amount of ambitious reform that Labour was able to pursue in its first term because of that huge 179-seat majority that it could rely on in the House of Commons. Similarly to the Labour Party in 1997, Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government have a sizeable majority and are able to introduce meaningful changes. We get the Housing Act of 1980, offering council house tenants the opportunity for the first time in their lives to be homeowners. The Employment Act of 1980 outlawed secondary strike action, which meant that one group of workers in another industry could not go out on strike in sympathy with workers in another industry. Most ambitiously, we get the introduction of monetarist economic policy, which is an attempt essentially to take money out of the economy to control inflation and bring inflation down, rather than to focus on controlling unemployment, which had been something that both Labour and Conservative governments had been committed to the decades previous to that. Well, we don't really see that until 1981, and that budget, during a recession, pledged both to raise taxes and cut spending, which was unprecedented for the time. And in 1982, I thought it was worth noting as well that the government introduces the Trident nuclear deterrent in that first term. A really good post-97 example of the impact of an election result on policy is 2010, because we get a coalition government and no manifesto is being fully implemented. So we get the so-called coalition agreement of 2010 between the Conservative Party led by David Cameron and the Liberal Democrats led by Nick Clegg. The political reality surrounding the 2010 coalition government is that of a global recession. And the coalition government's response was to introduce so-called austerity measures, cuts in government spending and tax rises at the same time. Now, that was controversial then as it is now. But that was the approach that those two parties working together in government came to. The Cabinet Office and the Treasury worked together to make government more efficient and claimed to have found a way to save the British taxpayer £10 billion in government spending. So, Nick Clegg's decision to go into coalition with David Cameron came down to his so-called red lines. And one of those red lines, something he would not enter government without a promise of, is a referendum on electoral reform. Had this been a single-party Conservative government, we would not have had the 2011 AV referendum. And in an act of political genius from David Cameron, he didn't promise, or he didn't commit to which electoral system would be offered in that referendum. And so we end up with a referendum on AV, which the Conservatives don't want because the Conservative Party wanted to maintain first past the post, but also an electoral system that actually can be less proportionate results than first past the post. So it didn't necessarily have full support within the Liberal Democrat Party too. One thing to mention in terms of policy, again, is education policy. As a comparison with 1997, we get the introduction of free schools, and schools are being encouraged to join or become academies. And it was the coalition government's aim that every school would have the opportunity to do so, which the government claimed would give schools more control over their own curriculum and over their own management and their own spending. Okay, finally, and if you've stayed with me this long, well done for making it this far. We've only got the effects of first past the post on the party system to look at. 1997 was a disastrous result for the Conservatives, and it was Labour's biggest election victory in its history. The Conservatives lost 178 seats compared to the 1992 election. Labour gained 146. The Liberal Democrats performed admirably, but we'll look on the next slide as to why that performance at the ballot box wasn't necessarily represented in seats in Parliament. So we do have a two-party system of sorts, because the Conservatives are quite clearly the second largest party, 3 times that of the third place party, the Liberal Democrats, but a significant majority of 179 seats for the Labour Party. And we're going to look on the next slide at how first past the post influenced the result when it comes to seats won. As you can see here, when we compare the percentage of the vote at the ballot box to the percentage of seats won in the House of Commons, there is one clear winner, and that is the Labour Party. The deviation from proportionality essentially means how many more seats in the House of Commons did the Labour Party get compared to its vote share. So the Labour Party got 21.2% more seats in the House of Commons than it did vote share. And you can see that the party that was most punished was the Liberal Democrats. 10 percentage points fewer seats won in the Commons than vote share at the ballot box. One thing that is worth mentioning is that when we look at other and the vote share versus the percentage of seats won, the deviation from proportionality is -1%, but there are a lot of parties that go into that. And regional parties, particularly in Northern Ireland, the DUP, Sinn Féin, because they are parties that only stand in that part of the United Kingdom, they will receive more seats than their vote share nationally, which will impact that percentage. So even though it says other parties -1, some minor parties, particularly those in Northern Ireland, the DUP and Sinn Féin are the two that come to mind before any others, those parties are actually better represented at Westminster. Okay, let's look at 1983, the effects of first past the post on the party system. The graph on the left, it's a bit grainy, but you can see actually the Conservative vote share dips ever so slightly from 79 to 83. And actually, what impacts the result more than anything else is the collapse of the Labour Party vote under Michael Foot. The Labour Party lose 60 seats, and that is partly down to voters going to the Liberal / Social Democrat Party alliance of the 1983 election. But partly down to an abandonment of the Labour Party's policies, which by many campaigners on the right of the party deemed to be what they called the longest suicide note in history. The Labour Party Manifesto has long been criticised for being too left-wing, too radical, and it turned voters off. But what you can see there, the effects of first past the post, actually give us the impression of the Conservatives becoming a more popular political party because they've gained 58 seats. But actually the national vote share for the Conservatives fell slightly from 1979 to 1983. And again, that winner-take-all nature of first past the post is what's influenced the result there. And finally, the 2017 election and the effects of first past the post on the result. You would think if a government has lost a majority and now governing as a minority government would experience a fall in vote share. But you can actually see that the vote share for the Conservative Party rose 5.5 percentage points from 2015 to 2017. And actually, the reason for the supply and confidence agreement with the DUP is because of two-party voting. You can see there that the combined vote share of the Conservative and Labour parties was 82.5%. And so it was Labour's rise in vote share by nearly 10 percentage points and the collapse of UKIP as a political force that meant that we had a high number of Conservative and Labour MPs in the House of Commons, which left the Conservatives just short of a majority, which led to the supply and confidence agreement with the DUP. For those of you who haven't covered that as a case study, what happens in that scenario, it's not a formal coalition, but the DUP, in exchange for pledges for funding for Northern Ireland, would vote with the government to approve the budget, but also to vote with the government on votes of no confidence. And that spending for Northern Ireland was believed to hit a ceiling of £1 billion. And so 2017 can be used as an exception that proves the rule of first past the post in a sense, because this is a very strange election result and one that we haven't seen in modern times. We get huge two-party voting, certainly a two-party system in the House of Commons, but the government falls short of a majority, which led to that supply and confidence agreement. It's very rare that we get minority governments in British politics. The last one before 2017 to 19 was back in 1974. And so you could use 2017 as a rare exception of the rule that first past the post provides us with a two-party system and governments with a clear majority. Because ironically, in this sense, two-party voting led to a government falling short of a majority in the House of Commons. Thank you everyone for watching this right the way through to the end, and I hope it was helpful for you in your preparation and revision for your A-level exams in the summer. If there's any questions that you have or any examples that you need from another case study, perhaps you've studied another election in class to the ones that I've covered here, please just leave a comment and I'll do my best to answer it in a satisfactory manner. Good luck to everybody sitting A-level politics exam this summer.